My Govanen. Welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and not too long ago I was perusing the Amazon Prime library and I ran across a thing that I didn't know existed, which was a a Twilight Zone episode, or actually two episodes it turns out, which were apparently written by Rod Serling way back in the day, but he never actually got around to doing them. So they ended up doing them sometime, I think it was in the 80s or 90s, and James Earl Jones kind of narrates. And one of these two episodes fit really neatly in with the theme of death as the gift of men, as portrayed in Tolkien's Legendarium. And so I thought it would make a really good way of kind of addressing the topic a little bit and exploring some of how Tolkien treats the idea of death as the gift of men. So, anyway, if you want to check out the Twilight Zone episode, it's the actual show is Twilight Zone Rod Serling's Lost Classics. And the specific episode, because there's two of them in this one particular 2 hour thing, the one that I'm focusing on here is Where the Dead Are. It's got Patrick Bergin, Jack Palance, and a few other people, I think, but those are really the two main characters, and it's their story that really is the heart of the issue. So I'm going to kind of explain briefly what the story is about, so there will be some spoilers there, and then I'm going to get into my exploration of death as the gift of men, how that kind of plays out in some of Tolkien's works. So the story Where the Dead Are begins with Patrick Bergin, who's playing a doctor, I believe it's in Boston, and he's at a medical school, and in comes this guy who's apparently about to have a ruptured appendix, and he tries to save him by taking out the appendix. Unfortunately, the guy dies, but then in examining the body, it turns out he's got this massive scar to the back of his head, which clearly indicates severe blunt trauma. And Bergen's character's like, this guy should have already been dead. Why is he here with a bad appendix? That doesn't make any sense. So he begins inquiring about this, and he finds out this guy is from, this area where some other medical doctor had moved years ago. And he's like, well, this guy was also kind of obsessed with the idea of death, and so he goes off in search of answers as to what may be behind all this. Jack Palance plays this other doctor who had long ago left, and he's named Wheaton in the show. But the basic thing that we find out, and this is where the spoilers come in, Palance's character at some point figured out by accident a concoction that, if injected within 15 minutes of somebody's death, would bring them back to life. But then they would have to get this injection over and over again, and it would vary by individual how often they would have to have it. And one of the other things that he ends up telling Bergen's character is, by getting them to avoid death or be resurrected, avoiding death again and staying alive becomes basically their only obsession. It's like they're going to do anything to make sure that they don't die again, including and up to murder. So he's basically ends up having to flee this island where he's staying, which is full of basically people who are being kept alive by this concoction that he's come up with. And eventually all of them die because he had this plan to basically let them all die by pretending to inject them, but actually just injecting them with saline so that it would wear out, and then there wouldn't be any serum left. He hadn't made any more. So they all presumably end up dying. But the interesting thing to me about this was the comment that he made about life being their only obsession. And this is where it really ties into Tolkien's work. So let's kind of look at that angle of it. So for Tolkien, of course, most of the Legendarium in the First Age focuses on the doings of elves and whatnot, and that's really Tolkien's original approach to a lot of his mythos. And the Lord of the Rings stuff, of course, is much more human-oriented, and by that I'm also including hobbits, because they're effectively humans. But that was never, when he first wrote The Hobbit, that was never originally supposed to be part of his original Legendarium, which was mostly about the elves, although men obviously get involved. And the elves, of course, are immortal. And one of the things that he says in some of his other writings, in letters and in his On Fairy Stories essay, is this idea of, what do fairies or elves or whatever we want to call them, what do they think of as interesting stories when they have such different attributes from us as humans? And one of the things he talks about is the idea of mortality. We think of mortality as this thing to be gained because immortality rather, is this thing to be gained because we are mortal. How would elves look at that question? And so he even says in one of his letters as well that one of the major themes of his works are like fall, mortality, and machine. Mortality is a big theme according to Tolkien, and it's not necessarily obvious reading all of this stuff that that's true, but if you pay attention you can definitely pick up on it. And the way this comes across in the Silmarillion primarily is the idea that while elves are immortal, men are mortal. And in certain conceptions, and again, this kind of depends on what stage of the writing process Tolkien is mortality an original attribute of the human condition, or is it a result of something like a fall, such as we get in the extended conversation between Finrod and Andreth in the Athrabeth, which is in Morgoth's Ring. I've done a video on that, and I'll link to that in the description so you can go check that out. But that conversation is a lot about the idea of, were humans always mortal, or were they perhaps immortal, and then in doing whatever evil thing they might have done in their past in following Morgoth, did they lose their immortality as a result of that? And another interesting thing in this regard, too, is another letter that Tolkien wrote where he says, well, somebody had read, and I can't remember if it was a priest or like it was a religious person in some way, or at least somebody who was very devout in their own right. They basically kind of confronted Tolkien on this idea of death being the gift of men, and they basically asked, but isn't it really a punishment? Aren't you kind of contradicting the biblical account? And Tolkien comes back and he says, well, but aren't God's punishments even gifts? And that really is kind of a profound question. And this really is where it takes off in terms of how he looks at death in the world. And we can see how it plays out in a lot of different characters. Because one of the things that distinguishes humans who are kind of on the good side and then humans who are definitely on the falling end of the spectrum and not really very, worthy of emulation, is how they approach death. And Aragorn, for instance, in the appendices, we learn that he, like many of the old kings of Numenor, when his time is approaching, he gracefully accepts the fact that he's going to die, and he basically goes out without fighting it. Whereas one of the key things that we learn about Numenor in its decline is that men, and especially the nobles and the kings, really try to hang on to life as long as they can. And then the inevitable result usually is that they, especially the kings, they'll try to hang on to their life and their throne as long as they possibly can and end up dying as broken, insane men. They lose their essential manhood, which is, he never describes it this way, but I have to believe that when he says that they're unmanned, what he means is they're no longer really even in control of themselves. They've, gone beyond senile to the point of madness and just devolved into more or less a creature seeking to extend its life by any means possible. And of course, this theme comes up over and over again, and it especially comes up in the context of the ring wraiths, because one of the draws of the rings of power for any human would be the ability to extend one's life. But as Gandalf tells Frodo, you don't gain more life, you merely continues until, he merely continues was his phraseology, the hypothetical owner or possessor of a ring. You continue until every moment is a weariness. You're not really gaining anything at the end of the day, but that prospect of getting more life and being able to do more things is always an allure for mortal men. And on the flip side of this, of course, we see the elves, who, one of the things that we learn about them is they are immortal, yes, and because they are immortal, they can achieve great things. They're very great at what they do. They can make things of great beauty. They can do things that are just beyond the comprehension of mortal men because they have time to learn and become better at everything. Humans don't. But one of the results of that is that elves kind of don't act as much. One of the things that Elrond says in the Council of Elrond in The Lord of the Rings is that too often the elves have simply fled Middle-earth, or we've just kind of sat around and done nothing. And you can see this in the Silmarillion as well. Elves tend to be kind of content to wait out things and not act soon. The men, the characters of human origin in the Silmarillion, they're all about getting things done, taking action, doing things while they have life to spare, because they're not going to last. And so there is a positive side for that immortality in that you get to learn more and become better at what you do. But there's also a negative side in that you tend to become complacent. You lose something of the driving force to achieve because you've got all the time in the world. So why do you need to hurry? And so you can see that dichotomy. And therefore, you can say one of the things about death being a gift is the idea that even though you lose some opportunities because you die naturally without having to be killed or something like that, you also maintain a sense of, I must do things, I must achieve, I must perform. You can't just sit around and fritter your life away, or you'll end up with nothing and you'll just be miserable because of it. But I don't think that's really the deepest aspect of it either. I think a very, very deep meaning to what Tolkien means when he says that death is maybe a punishment, but even God's punishments are gifts, is that assuming you had a race like humans who fell in the way that humans did, and remember, Tolkien being a Catholic, he's going to have a very strong idea of original sin, the fallenness of human nature, that we're irrevocably broken as a species. That's his view. That being the case, do you want people being immortal? Is it really a good thing for men to live forever? If you had a corrupt species, and I mean, this is obviously, going to the far, far extreme, but consider orcs. Depending on which stage of writing Tolkien is at, Tolkien's view is that orcs are corrupted elves, or corrupted men, even in some views. And he's never quite comfortable with the idea of orcs as being the children of Iluvatar, because then it's like, but they seem irredeemable, and that just doesn't seem to work with the idea of a good god creating them, and then how can they fall to that level? But anyway, orcs, if they're just evil and irredeemably evil, can you imagine what it would be like if they were all immortal? Now, granted, orcs, because of how corrupt and evil they are, tend to kill each other off a lot, and therefore don't continue regardless of immortality. But the idea of having a species that corrupt, having immortal life, is in and of itself kind of terrifying. And while humans obviously are not orcs in the sense that they're not that far gone down the path of being totally debased, it is still true that you would not want someone, say, like Denethor, living forever. Denethor becomes more corrupt over time, not less, and there doesn't seem to be much prospect of that ever changing. You do have characters like Boromir who kind of redeem themselves, although you also have the argument that Boromir was never a totally corrupt individual to begin with, and he was acting under the influence of the ring. But you still have the problem of not everybody's going to be like an Aragorn or a Faramir or a Boromir. Lots of men are corrupt or corruptible to the point that if they lived forever, it would be bad. It would be dangerous. And so the idea that death is a gift, I think also plays along these lines that if you were corrupt and you just were allowed to live forever and ever and ever, especially in the view of somebody like Tolkien, with a Christian view of the afterlife, in which those who are on the good side go to heaven, and then the others who are on the bad side merit punishment in hell. If you live forever, you're racking up a lot of punishment over who knows how long before somebody comes along and, offs you the way that even elves can be killed. So in this sense, death is also a gift because it limits a corrupt person's ability to do harm to both themselves and others. And therefore, it prevents you from becoming the worst possible things. And that's, there again, we go back to the Nazgul. The Nazgul are kind of like that quintessential, worst case scenario. The Nazgul, they're not even fully in control of themselves anymore. They are slaves to their own desire because they have been enslaved by the rings, and therefore Sauron is basically the only thing they serve anymore. They no longer have their own will, their own personality maybe, but they're going to live forever. But what good is that going to do them? At the end of the day, in a just world ruled by a just God, Eru Ilúvatar in this case, that can't help them in the end. It's only going to make matters worse that they lived forever. And here again, this is another thing that is interesting because this came up recently in the news, and this also kind of connects to the Númenórean element. There was a story I saw not too long ago, and in fairness, I did not read the whole thing, and I gather that there are elements of it that ameliorate against what it sounds like. But apparently some people are looking into the possibility that injecting the blood of a younger person into an older person might slow aging. Now, like I said, I don't know all the details of that, but on the surface, that sounds awfully creepy. And it made me think not only of historical parallels like, the Aztecs murdering people as human sacrifices, but also the Númenóreans, because in near the fall of Númenor, Sauron had them committing human sacrifices in order to appease, Morgoth, basically, in the hopes of gaining eternal life for themselves. So this idea of blood sacrifice in order to extend your own life is nothing new. And like I say, that news article, I didn't read into it, and I read a little bit that made me think that it wasn't quite as creepy as maybe it was made to sound in the headlines. But it does raise the issue of, when is it too much to try to extend your life indefinitely? Is it really worthwhile? Do we gain anything meaningful by doing literally everything within our power to extend our life a few more months, a few more years? Because again, do you kind of lose your humanity in that process at some point? Just like in the story in the Twilight Zone, once you get to the point where your only obsession is living longer, what are you willing to do in order to keep living longer? What might you sacrifice in that pursuit? That can end badly in so many ways. And obviously, I'm not saying that we shouldn't use medical technology to delay death or anything like that. And I'm not passing any moral judgments on individuals in their own individual circumstances, because every circumstance is individual and needs to be looked at within its own context. But I do think Tolkien was onto something, and it is a warning which we should all heed, which is, be aware of the principle that, if nature has basically determined that we're all going to die, perhaps that's for the best, one way or the other, whether it's God, whether it's just the nature of things, whatever it is. Certain boundaries ought not be crossed, nor should they be pushed necessarily. And so I think that's kind of the lesson of both Rod Serling's story and at least one of the lessons of Tolkien's stories, is that while death may be a lamentable aspect of our existence, it ought to be accepted, and it ought not to be looked at as something that we should do away with no matter what it takes, because some things are worse than death, and we don't really want to find out what those things might be if we push the envelope too far. So that was a pretty heavy topic, but I think a very interesting one. And like I said, the Rod Serling's classics, go find it if it's still on Amazon Prime. If you got a subscription, it was free whenever I watched it. It might still be up there. Very interesting episode. The first one I didn't find as interesting, but the second one to me was really interesting. And anybody who's really familiar with the Numenorian experience and whatnot in Tolkien's world will probably pick up on some of these same parallels and find it a very interesting comparison. But anyway, I just wanted to talk about that because it does raise a lot of really interesting topics, and even though it is really heavy, the idea that these two very different men in two different times had a lot of kind of the same view of death, I thought was worth talking about. So hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, do give it a thumbs up and share it around. You can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore for some occasional Tolkien-related trivia questions. You can also find me on Rumble and support me on Patreon. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.